So I think that's just the perfect time to move over to Professor Ramon Farré from Barcelona. I think we'll have to switch seats. And who's going to talk more about this important topic of big data, which is the new challenge also for medicine, because I can tell you I lately watched something on the web about a COPD hackathon in Boston, where people that you rather know from the Big Bang Theory show took care of medical healthcare data and found some interesting stuff in COPD. So we get new other groups involved in research around medicine, and that's being enabled by big data. So Ramon's going to answer for us, hopefully, the question, is the big data our next big frontier in our field? Thank you, Ramon.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, contrary to my colleague Jean-Louis, I'm not presenting original data, so I have no problem that you not to take photos, but I think that you can have available the presentation for all of you.
Sure.
I have made attention to put in the presentation all the links and all the reference so that you can take a more detailed view of the idea. So I will try to refer about what is big data and what big data may represent for respiratory and in particular for sleep medicine. You know that big data is something that is relatively new, and a lot of people is working about big data. And sometimes we all don't understand exactly what is the meaning of that, at least the formal meaning of that. So first, some disclosures. I have been involved in some contracts testing CPAP devices with different companies. So what is big data? So there is no formal official definition, but there is a consensus that big data involves large volumes of high velocity, complex and variable data that require advanced techniques and technologies to enable the capture, storage, distribution, management and analysis of the information. So according to this well-accepted definition, big data involves two main players. On the one hand, new technologies. New technologies are required to acquire information, lots of information from many sources, but also very important, big data requires new data processing concepts and tools to interrelate the specific data and a specific contextual information used in the world of big data. So one of the aims of my talk is that at the end, we all have a clear idea that information is not knowledge. So we can have lots and lots of information. If we don't process it adequately, we will not have useful knowledge. And also some confusion that some kinds exist that big data is not big trials. There is something I will try to explain you completely different. What about big data in respiratory and sleep medicine? What are the potential sources of big data? So there are, of course, specific sources concerning sleep medicine and general medicine, for instance, from electronic health record, including clinical data, genomic and proteomic information of the patients. Also information from health-related applications that the patient can be running in his or her phone or tablet. Also physiological monitoring with wearable devices that are more and more extended, and nighttime monitoring of polysomnography at home, CPAP application, or home mechanical ventilation. And what about the general sources of big data? One source is from the social networks. For instance, what is the patient activity and relationship in sites like Facebook and so on. Also information from the world of business. What are the buying habits of the patient? What are the diet activity of the patient? The diet activity of the patient, and so on. So we have to be clear that the information companies have about us is tremendous. We usually wear always a phone, and we are perfectly localized always. We pay our supermarket, everything, with credit card, and companies know if I buy a pear, an orange, or whatever. So there is a lot of information which is inside the knowledge of the companies in general. And also, of course, specific apps linked to patient behavior. So This tremendous amount of potential information, how should be processed? Of course, there is a need for new analytical concepts and tools to extract medical knowledge. So you will see that I have illustrated all my screens with using references from 2015, 16, and even from this year, because this is a very novel topic. So in general, when we analyze data for healthcare, there are several different steps. On the one hand, the first one is the acquisition of the data. Sorry, this is the acquisition of the data. A high speed, usually. So the system requires fast data digestion. Then the system should incorporate a lot of demography, lab information, contextual information in general to mix to the health data recorded. And then there are two steps in data processing. One is signal processing and feature extraction, and then another one which is diagnostic and predictive and predictive to achieve actionable insights, for instance, by triggering best actions, alarms, clinical decision support, and so on. So you can see that there are two stages. On the left, there are the data acquisition, and the two on the right are the data processing. And you can imagine that these steps of data processing are really very complex. It's interesting to note that biostatisticians are aware that big data pose new problems. So in this publication, there is a very interesting figure when you can see here, in one axis, the computational complexity, for instance, starting with selected biomarkers, or large number of processed molecular markers, or raw data from high-throughput platforms. And in the other axis, you have the biostatistical complexity. Just one data source, multiple data source, multiple measurements over time, or market-dependent modification treatment of time. So when one of the variables is the smallest one in that line, you have to use, let's say, the conventional statistic tools. But when we are moving to the area of the high biostatistical complexity and computational complexity, we are going inside the world of big data. This slide is just to illustrate how complex the mathematical and statistical tools are required to process the different levels of data. In this particular paper published this year, the authors correlate the eligibility criteria, generalizability, and adverse events using big data for patients with clinical trials. So they are trying to merge the conditions in clinical trials and the information obtained from big data. And as you may understand, this is very complex. I either don't understand the details of that, just to illustrate how complex is it. In fact, in a recent paper published in the New England last September, 6 months ago, entitled Predicting the Future, Big Data, Machine Learning, and Clinical Medicine, they say that machine learning has become ubiquitous and indispensable for solving complex problems in most sciences. And the same methods will open up vast possibilities in medicine. So this is just to illustrate that we need more and more complex statistical and mathematical tools to process the data. Just to illustrate again that, you can see here that the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the States have produced a document published in February this year, so yesterday, that came from a workshop addressed to refining the concept of scientific inference when working with big data. So this is a big problem, and just to have you an idea, the content of this publication, which is a summary of the workshop, where one of the topics were big data holds both great promise and perils. Inference requires evaluating uncertainty. One characteristic of big data is that there is a lot of uncertainty. This contrasts a lot with the classical clinical trials where everything is very well defined, the inclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria, well definition of the outcome variables and so on. So almost there is no uncertainty. In the case of big data, there is uncertainty and we have to deal with it. Another point linked to the difficulty is that statisticians must engage early in experimental design and data collection activities. The other one expresses how young is the discipline, because it says that open research questions can propel both the domain sciences, in that case sleep medicine, and the field of statistics forward. So there will be a progressive and parallel advancement of both the domain sciences and the technical of statistical analysis. And finally, opportunities exist to strengthen statistics educations at all levels. This is, in my opinion, very important, because we are talking about a new kind of analysis, a new kind of gathering data, and usually our community, our professionals, we have not been educated on that techniques, because are really new. So it's very important to make an effort in the different contexts we can have the opportunity to really try to teach, try to explain, try to educate the new generations of physicians on what is big data and what are the concepts more important in big data. It's clear that the topic of big data has social and political implications, mainly to the patient privacy protection. So there are many questions about regulatory perspective. So this is reflected because you can see here in the year 2014, the Executive Office of the President of the United States Council of Advisors on Science and Technology presented to the President a report entitled Big Data and Privacy, a Technological Perspective. So in 2014, in the States, they were really at the highest political level, they were really worried about what could be the implications of big data in medicine. This was in America. In Europe, similar happens. You have here that the European Data Protection Supervisor have produced 1 year ago a document entitled Meeting the Challenges of Big Data, a call for transparency, user control, data protection by design, and accountability, where they try to merge and to make consistent the big data analysis with the privacy of the patients, the dignity of the patients, the freedom, etc. So my point is that big data is not only a technical issue, it's not only an issue of data processing, it's not only an issue of clinical data and of medicine, it involves also a lot of social and political issues. There are risks, of course. There are potential advantages, but there are risks. And in fact, you can see here a publication of Science in 2015 entitled The End of Privacy. From big data to ubiquitous internet connections, technology empowers researchers and the public, but makes traditional notions of privacy obsolete. So we have to be aware of that. And just last year, in that case in Nature, they published a note saying the myth of anonymity. And they realized that with some knowledge and some dedicated effort, you can identify people from genomic data. So this idea that make anonymated data records and so on, this with big data disappear because there is so parallel information that even if you eliminate the name, the age, the gender, whatever, there is sufficient information in parallel to identify people. Which finally leads to a question: what are the actual risks? So who owns the data? And the question about open data for healthcare. And in this publication, it's 1 month ago, in February, 1 year ago, there were, the authors were from different institutions, mainly in the UK, and they comment that increasing popularity of social media, GPS-enabled mobile apps, and tracking wearable devices, the IT industry and medtech giants are pursuing new projects without clear public and policy discussion about ownership and responsibility of user-generated data. So this sentence poses the problem into the question. And they say at the same time that it's time It's a golden opportunity for the professional responsibility of the research community, so us, to challenge policymakers and regulatory bodies to improve all the data protection of our patients in that case. Regardless of these potential dangers, everybody understands that big data has a lot of opportunities and a lot of future, and there are a lot of public initiatives promoting the application of this kind of new approach to medicine. In particular, among the public initiatives, we may note that the National Institute of Health in the States launched a few years ago an initiative, this the big data to knowledge, that is focused on implementing advancements in biomedical big data. This was in the States, and also very recently, last December, in Europe, the European Community published a final report about the study on big data and public health, telemedicine, and healthcare. So this is just to illustrate that regardless of the potential dangers, there is a lot of public initiatives promoting the application of big data in medicine, and in particular in sleep medicine. But not only the authorities, not only the NIH or the European Commission, also the global internet players are very interested in implementing big data in health. Just taken from the web, Google, for instance, is more and more trying to make agreements with hospitals, in that case with a British hospital, to give access to the healthcare of 1.6 million patients. And another example is Microsoft, the other big player, that is launching a platform, which is Azure, which is providing opportunities for personalized healthcare with people. So it means that the big internet players, that are the players that know everything about us, everything about our private life, about us, they are going to play also in the healthcare. And more in particular, if we descend a little bit in the scale, also the medical device and pharma companies are more and more trying to be involved in the world of big area. Just picking 5 examples from the website, for instance, Philips is involved in big data. You have all the links here. Also, ResMed is publicizing his involvement in big data. Air Liquide, again, is also linking venture capital to big data. And big medical devices companies like General Electric, also big data, or pharmaceutical companies like Bayer, and so on. So I just put 5 examples here, but if you just play in the website and you look any kind of company involved in healthcare, they have publicly showed their activities and their interests in the big data world. So going specifically to our topic, so what is the potential role of big data in sleep disorder breathing? Well, there is published last year an interesting review or interesting opinion paper from the group of Susan Redline that make a perspective of what could be the potential application of the big data strategy to sleep disorder breathing. And just to be brief, may help in the precision medicine, so in identifying patient subgroups. Also in recognition the differences in patients, and then to improve the management of outcomes, so some kind of personalized medicine. But that this will require efforts, investments, and some change in our current medical and research culture. I think that this is particularly interesting because, as I mentioned, big data involves changing a little bit the way that we interpret the data. Susan Redline and colleagues suggest that it will be interesting to expand the electronic health records with well-defined sleep data, and finally, to integrate the patient-collected data with the world of wearable device market, which is increasing at very high speed and will be very useful to gather information about how patients behave, both during the night and also during the day. What are the reality? Are there already published data? Well, Professor Pepin has shown some results more or less related to big data that are under consideration for publication. And last year, for instance, there were two publications by the group of David Gozal in Chicago, where they used a health company database, and they analyzed 1,700,000 patients with OSA and the same number of matched controls. These two studies, one was addressed to linking sleep apnea and cancer, and the other one linking the comorbidities of OSA in terms of sex and age. This study is not really purely big data, but it goes into that direction because it deals with a lot of patients and also have some of the characteristic problems in big data. There is uncertainty and lack of information. So you can imagine that if 1,700,000 patients were included in a clinical trial, there would be a very clear amount of information, well-defined, and a lot of questions could be solved. But if you take 1 million or almost 2 million people from a record of the health company insurance, there are a lot of missings. So you have to be smart to be able to round off as much as possible these uncertainties, trying to get the most reliable conclusion you have. So given these limitations, just to comment, I will skip that. Given these limitations, one of these two papers was accompanied by an editorial that was entitled Deriving Information from External Big Databases and Big Data Analytics. And I underline, all that glitters is not gold. So when one sees a study with almost 2 million patients, one says, wow, this should be marvelous. But well, when you look at the inside, you can see what are the problems. So here in the editorialists say that we must not forget that small data, so the conventional analysis, often offer information that is not contained in big data. Therefore, perhaps it's time to focus in all data revolution in using data from all traditional and new sources together. So the idea that they provide is that, okay, big data provide useful information, but also the conventional way of analyzing the data is useful. And this idea is reinforced not from the field of respiration, but from the field of cardiology. In also last year editorial from Jack saying big data is coming, it seems equally obvious that regardless of the amount of data we have, that without randomized trials, we can never rule out unidentified confounders. So the situation now is that besides preliminary approaches and current developments, our field, the field of sleep disordered breathing, is waiting for results from big data. So we are more or less expecting new results, but these new results already doesn't exist. So the question is, will big data be another partially or temporarily failed frontier in medicine? So you know, in the title, it's made big data the next frontier in medicine. We are in a world where the marketing is very important, and every few years there appears a new issue, a new frontier, a new big point. And for instance, stem cells raised a lot of potential solutions. It seems that it will solve all the problems of the medicine. Also, genomic medicine raised a lot of expectations. Also, gene therapy raised a lot of expectations 10, 15 years ago. And at present, these new frontiers has advanced, but have not provided the extremely big expectations that they were announcing at the beginning. So will happen the same with big data? Well, we have to take into account that there is one concept in business, which is the Death Valley in new healthcare innovations. So this is characteristic. This corresponds to the real case of one therapy, monoclonal antibody therapy. And you can see here the expectations and here the time. And you see that after an initial discovery, there were great expectations, but then suddenly a disillusion because real life is not so big as the expectation posed. And then slowly, a big increase in product improvement, and then achieving the status of technology maturity. But this seems complex, but this is the most simple process, because in many cases there are several death valleys. And this also, again, is a real case in products of bioengineering skin products. And you can see that there was an initial discovery, additional discoveries, inflated expectation, a first disillusion, a resurrection because new discoveries, a second disillusion, and now technology maturity, and now this market is really stable. The point is, how many death valleys will have we in applying big data in sleep disorder breathing? So this depends mainly on how intelligent we are as community in implementing this new concept of big data into our problem of sleep breathing disorders. So to conclude, first is an statement, it's an obvious statement that the technology, either electronic health records or ICTs or wearables, and both medicine, in genomic, proteomic, and metabolomics, make big amounts of weight range data available. Second is that the extracting knowledge from big data requires to replace the classical rationality in clinical trials by a different conceptual analytical approach. Big data is coming not to replace clinical trials, but to complement them, therefore minimizing the limitations of each methodology. And finally, by incorporating the big data approach, the field of sleep disorder breathing has an opportunity to improve basic and clinical knowledge for improving the diagnosis and therapy of patients. But we have to be smart, intelligent, to adapt this new technology to our problem, because if not, we risk to fail. Thank you very much.